My first exposure to channeled material came while visiting my family at the Findhorn community in spring break when I think it was 12, maybe 13. And my father had in our Volvo a cassette loaned to him by someone at Findhorn by someone with a strange voice. And I said, "Who's that?" And my father said, "This is a channeled entity called Lazarus." And given the Christian backdrop combined with a certain amount of trauma, a certain amount of loneliness, a certain fear of being punished, one of the kind of deepest feelings was, is this somehow evil? Is this unsafe? Is this, what's the angle here? And so the filters that I had at the time were, one, is Lazarus trying to control me? Because, that kind of moves it towards a cult-like danger of, someone trying to steal your power, get you to do something you don't want to do, something no 12-year-old wants to do. And is it somehow evil? So there's this idea in the Judeo-Christian ethic of good and evil. And of course, the Christians like to say that their God is good and everyone else is evil. The Hindu gods, heathen gods, evil gods. Ours is the one, everyone else is evil. And of course, Lazarus wasn't Christian. And so, this left me looking at Lazarus through this lens that I had been given by my culture, by my parents to some extent. My father read the Old Testament when I was 5 years old and seemed to enjoy, role-playing God, basically. And the Old Testament God is quite a son of a bitch. And so, sons of bitches punish you when you don't do what you're told, much like parents. And so, was God going to punish me if I listened to Lazarus was kind of a background question. And I took this fairly seriously, in part because trauma and pain and isolation are a pretty serious thing when you have varying degrees of complex PTSD, as an example. That comes from repeated trauma, from fear, from lack of traumatic repair. So it's very easy for a traumatized child to believe in a traumatizing giant as God, because that's essentially what the culture and what the parents are to a child. In a parentally illiterate culture, meaning we are a culture that, for the most part, has no memory, no training, no recollection around what it's like to be 2 years old. And we cover our ignorance and our willful denial of that terrain in the psyche by saying, well, it doesn't matter because we've forgotten it. Nothing important goes on there. And in fact, all of the science says that a tremendous amount goes on in terms of template forming that are very hard to rework in later years because they're pre-language. It's very hard to grapple with something you don't have words for. It's very hard to think a thought without language. So it's very hard to remember something without language. And so we've just kind of brushed it under the carpet as a culture. Feeling bad, feeling shame, feeling punished and scared of being punished, feeling isolated and separate, I could very much believe in a tormenting God or devil, and because I was living to some extent in that experience. And so was this fellow Lazarus going to get me in trouble? And I listened, and the thing that I looked for was, could this harm me directly? Obviously, if God was a son of a bitch and was going to, throw you to a lake of fire for worshiping false gods or having politically incorrect friends, then that could hurt me. But that aside, I wanted to know if Lazarus could hurt me in some way. And I wanted to know if Lazarus was trying to control me in some way. And I wanted to know if the material was intelligent, if it had value, and was it fun? That was less of a focus in terms of initially looking like, is this evil? And the material that I worked with and listened to was a cassette called Earth Energy, Earth Power. And so after the car ride, I took the tape out of the car and went with my Walkman for a walk in the pine forests of Findhorn in Scotland and listened to the tape. So there were a couple of things that I noticed. I didn't feel any power grabbing type of stuff. There was expansive knowledge, and then there was some humor, which I appreciated, and it felt somewhat, I guess, exciting to learn things that I certainly wasn't learning in school. And I didn't see anything wrong with it. I'd heard of ley lines before, power grids and stuff on the earth. It didn't seem that radical. It wasn't saying give us all your money or everyone should wear orange or something like that. And so I concluded that Lazarus was not harmful. Then the next question was the Christian God going to punish me when I died for learning from Lazarus rather than reading the Bible? And so that was the next question. And I realized that was a possibility. That was a possibility. However, I didn't think it was very nice. Meaning, if God did punish people, I thought he was a jerk for punishing someone like me for listening to Lazarus. And so what that did for me is it took him out of the terrain of a god and put him into the terrain of a jerk. Like, I don't know. But anyone who would punish me for listening to this material is a jerk. Not someone that I aspire to be with. Are there powerful jerks in the world? Absolutely. Might a powerful jerk exist after death? Absolutely. But were they a god or were they a jerk? And I thought if someone punishes you for learning, they're a jerk. So the real question was, did I want to give up my freedom? Because there might be a big jerk after death who would punish me for being free. And I said overall that I'm willing to take the risk, meaning there may not be a big jerk after death. There's no one smiting the ground right now with lightning because I'm listening to Lazarus. No one has smitten my parents down for abusing me. So there might be there might be someone out there, but I'm willing to take the risk. So that was the doorway in. Now, the next question was the material valid? And what I meant was was this a phony? Was this some person just trying to make money by pretending to be a channel rather than saying, hey, I'm a person who has these ideas? And I did not have an answer. And so I looked for another way around the question. If the material was phony, meaning if Jack Purcell, the channel, didn't channel Lazarus, but just came up with all these tapes on his own, how could I be sure? And I realized you can't be sure. So I looked at it another angle. I said, well, what if Jack Purcell made the tape called Earth Energy, Earth Power? And what if my father had been playing it in the cassette deck of the car, and it had said, this is Jack Purcell, here's my thoughts on Earth Energy and Earth Power. And had said the exact same things, made the same jokes and all that. Would I enjoy the material? And while I was at Findhorn, I had attended a quarterly conference, and amongst the presenters was Sam Keen, who talked about his book Faces of the Enemy, and he poked fun at Findhorn for having combative relationships with the Air Force, which the air base was right next door, a military air base. It was just a fence between the Findhorn community, the spiritual community, and the Scottish Air Force base. Just a few hundred feet apart, and they would fly, fighter jets while Findhorn was doing conferences. So, the Findhorn people were pissed at the air base, and the air base, it seemed like, would sometimes go out of its way to, disrupt the spiritual meditations. And, and Sam Keen was poking fun at this, and I thought it was all very interesting. The Findhorn people got very upset when he was poking fun. The whole thing was very interesting. And I thought that was much more interesting than school, watching that dynamic. And so I left school to attend Findhorn, and that Sam Keen didn't say he was channeled. And Sam Keen didn't have as rich a body of material as, this Earth Energy, Earth Power tape. The book could be summarized in a few sentences. We put stereotypical faces on our enemies to dehumanize them, and then we go to war with a projected enemy that we've created and put onto other human beings, and that part of the process of restoring peace is to take these faces back and see human beings. Reasonable thought, intelligently put together, nicely presented, useful thought, interesting material, great idea. So I concluded that if Jack Purcell had presented all of that material in an audio recording without notes, that he was a pretty phenomenal presenter. And it was worth $24.99, the price of a cassette package of 3 hours of that quality of material. That was a fair price. All books had a price. Tapes were more interesting than books, so that was good, that it was in audio format. And the accent was weird, but what if it had been Jack's accent? What if Jack had just read the book in a normal voice? If anything, it would have been nicer. So I concluded that the material would be valuable if Jack read it in his own accent, because Lazarus has, a different accent. The voice sounds very different. And I thought, if anything, more people might be open to it, because if the tape had just said, this is Jack Purcell, here's some ideas on energy grids and stuff, I wouldn't have said, is this evil, is this, unchristian, etc. And so it seemed like if Jack was doing a scam, it was a little bit of a hokey scam, because he was raising all these unnecessary questions and uncertainties when he could make just as much money presenting good material under his own name and take all the credit. And so why not drop the accent, say it was me, and produce great material there? And so ultimately I said it didn't matter whether Lazarus was part of Jack's unconscious, whether Lazarus was a fantasy, whether Lazarus was a non-physical being, whether Jack was remembering dreams. None of that mattered. If the material could stand on its own 2 feet. And what is good material? Is it useful? Is it more useful than other material? Is, I guess, even more important, since there's so much material out there. Is it more useful than other material? In terms of what? Expanding consciousness, creating more success, creating more healing, creating more fun. Is it useful for doing useful things like that? And it seemed like it was one of the contenders, meaning there's a lot of useful material out there, and this seemed like it was in the high quality useful material category. And so the way I worked it in my mind was, 1, if God was a son of a bitch and was going to punish me afterwards, I didn't want to pray to such a son of a bitch. 2, the material itself didn't seem to be harmful. And 3, I would have enjoyed and bought the material if Jack Purcell had published it under his own name and just said it's me. And I would have bought the material and enjoyed it if someone said my name is Pizavig or Pokali or John or whatever. The name didn't matter. That what mattered was the material itself. And the material was engaging. I enjoyed my walk. I laughed, I smiled, and so that was the doorway. Now, then comes the next thing, which is leaving Findhorn and going to a school out in Birch Tree, Missouri, where there were 5 delinquent boys. It was called Phoenix International School for Peace and Ecology, but there were just 5 delinquent boys, and it didn't really, it didn't bring out the best in me. So I went into a slow dissociative depression. And there I was, sleeping during the day, staying up all night reading J.R.R. Tolkien and reading other books by, there was an author called Ken Carey who actually lived a few blocks away, and who I'd read the Starseed Transmissions and Return of the Bird Tribes, 2 books by Ken Carey, also channeled. And there I was doing that, and I became slowly depressed. And in my depressed state, I didn't and couldn't feel and connect with myself, and I couldn't feel and connect with other people. I felt dissociative. And I associated that feeling with being somewhat spiritual, like I was above it all. I didn't associate it with trauma and depression. But I didn't really know what it was, and it's like, I don't quite understand this state of consciousness. But in that place, here on the bookshelf of the school, the owner's bookshelf, was a Lazarus tape that belonged to the owner of the school's girlfriend. And I listened to that. And lo and behold, in that deep dissociative and depressed state, I felt met. And the image that I say is that the way I felt was that I was maybe 30 feet underwater. I was sinking and down in a very slow and quiet place down at the ocean floor. It was sand, and I could see people playing up on the surface. I could see their legs moving, and vaguely, a little bit of sound came down, but it was very quiet. There was a lot of pressure. It was very slow. And then down in that place, there was 30 feet of water between me and the rest of the world. But then it seemed like the keel of a boat went by, right at eye level. And that was Lazarus. That was Lazarus meeting me where I was. And this was much more interesting because, you know, there's lots of great presenters, there's lots of great material, there's lots of great books. But when I met Ken Carey, he didn't meet me at all. When I met him in person. When I talked with the owner, when I talked with my parents, none of that was meeting me where I was. And so I thought this is an interesting pass because I'm encountering a singular presence that is meeting me where I am, meaning I don't know anyone else who's meeting me here. I'm here. Everyone else is up there, and Lazarus is here. Now, this was a significant meeting, as opposed to a safe meeting and a fun meeting. This was a significant meeting. Where I am, Lazarus is there. And so I decided to pivot towards Lazarus as the only relationship that felt viscerally real at that moment in time. And so I bought a bunch of cassettes and began listening and practicing, etc. The Elegance of Abundance was one. Conquering Fear was one. The Power of Dominion was one. Self-Worth and Self-Respect was one. These 4 tapes I began working with. And Lazarus talks very fast, and like the Elegance of Abundance one with the addiction to money, I mean, I was making $5 a week, volunteering cooking for the school. This was not a, so stockbroking and Michael Milken's financial scandals mentioned on the tape, this was a mile away from where I was. And so there was some struggle that Lazarus kept saying he was talking to me and only to me. It's like, well, why talk about all that? But nonetheless, that was the significant point, was saying not only is this valuable and not dangerous, but this is a singular meeting in some of the stages of or states of consciousness in which I find myself. And so, so we're now around 13. And, from 13 on, one of my primary financial investments was buying Lazarus tapes I would rent Lazarus tapes and make recordings. I would rent Lazarus videos and make audio recordings of the video through the out jack in the VCR player. And in that way, I could take my time with the material, as opposed to, I think it was $5 a day, but it might take me a week to work with the material. And I was making $7 an hour at the time as a babysitter, and or $6 an hour, and that was that was a significant chunk of money. And slowly I accumulated as many of the Lazarus tapes as I could. I bought some of them directly. I rented all that I could. I asked the library to buy some. I bought some and donated them to the library and made recordings of the ones I had donated. And I asked Concept Synergy, the producer of the Lazarus material, what to do in that terrain. And And so in this, in this phase, I was just absorbing what has Lazarus said here, and what has Lazarus said here, and how does that fit together. It was also a somewhat dissociative and painful period in that, as I got deeper into the Lazarus material, my parents' marriage continued to fracture, which expressed itself and got downloaded in a shame dump on each of the siblings. And so the destructive aspect of my 4 younger siblings was evoked and invoked as a distraction from my parents who didn't want to deal with their feelings. And, the shouting, the violation, the chaos, etc. was very difficult to deal with. And I'm being told constantly by Lazarus that I'm creating my reality 100%, no ifs, ands, or buts, that if I didn't have payoffs, my parents wouldn't be getting a divorce, for example. If I changed my belief and stuff, then, then my parents would be sticking together. And here we start to go into murky, confusing waters. Because there is a tendency for a child, an adolescent, to take on the shame of their parents, and there is a tendency in a shadow-averse culture to dump the problems and inadequacies of the parents onto the child. And so all of that was going on. And then I didn't have any adult friends that put me first. I had, as is common in kind of Christian type subcultures, is that the parent should be put first, and so nobody advised my parents to look for the best in the children. But when the children naturally expressed their feelings about being abused, they were advised to forgive and understand the parent. And this is what is completely backwards in our culture. We ask the child to be more of an adult than the grown-ups. And we express this betrayal and this backwardness by continually coaching and admonishing and punishing children into having the feelings, or at least talking about the things that we want them to talk about, and avoiding the things otherwise. And this is a disaster, but it's what we do. And so my one adult or grown-up friend, that I talked about, some of the hate and depression and anger, etc., with my parents, encouraged me to be more understanding and forgiving of my parents. But I wasn't even in touch with the full amount of rage and feelings and depression, etc. about all that. I was suicidal at that time. And here's Lazarus over and over again saying, you create your own reality, that everyone else is an illusion, created. And so this moves into some of the more painful terrain and the darker terrain that I couldn't recognize as a 12-year-old trying to assess the pros and cons of the material. I would say that the darkest aspect of the material was the predisposition for an emotionally and relationally and traumatically illiterate teenager to take on not only the parent's shame without the ability to push back and get support from the community, from government, from either parent, or from any friend, but then to have Lazarus piling on this thing like, you created this. And it's like, I don't get it. I have nothing to do with these parents. I don't want them. I don't want them to get a divorce. I don't want them to hurt themselves. I don't want them to hurt my younger siblings. I don't want to feel this way. And so, fuck off, Lazarus, or give me something that works. And so this moves into then the anger of the adolescent, which I didn't express at the time because Lazarus seemed like the only sane, healthy part of my life. And so, the idea of having mixed emotions or that it was safe, it didn't feel safe to be angry because it wasn't safe with my parents. My father could be violent, so it wasn't safe being angry at him. It didn't feel safe to be angry. And so, there's this endless snowballing effect of, well, why did you create, and all of this? And it's like there's no way out of all of these feelings. And I would say that piled up and piled up and piled up to a point where I was fairly dissociative with my feelings. At the same time, I read the Seth books, another channeled material. So Ken Carey, Seth, little bit of Ramtha, and mostly Lazarus, 95% Lazarus. Now, there was one set of tapes that really did work. And I say really work because most of the time I would go into the room of beliefs that Lazarus talked about and write out a new belief, and I didn't feel any different. And my parents still fought each other right and left. So, it felt actually threatening to do the Lazarus techniques, like these 33-second techniques, because Lazarus seemed to be blaming the practitioner. Lazarus basically said, do a 33-second technique, and if it doesn't change, you didn't want it. And I had done enough techniques that it's like, this is a setup. If I say I want my parents to heal and blah, 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 and I take that on, that I didn't want them to heal if they don't come back together again in 3 days, I'm going to be blaming and criticizing myself again and left in this endless loop. My parents are already blaming and punishing us as children and saying it's all our fault. I mean, it had nothing to do with them not having a condom. No. We ruined their life. We did this, we did that. Your mother, your father. It was all our fault. And it felt like Lazarus was saying it was all our fault. And the grown-ups around us saying we should be more understanding of the parents. And the teachers saying it was all our fault. And now Lazarus saying it's all my fault. I didn't want it. I didn't have the right belief, blah, 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 blah. And that just felt very dangerous. And so I continued listening and learning, but I stopped doing those techniques because as a 15-year-old in position of suicide, how was I going to, it's like if the techniques aren't working and Lazarus is saying they are working, that throws negative light on Lazarus. What's the problem with that? Well, Lazarus is the best thing close to a parent that I have. Except that it's a paid relationship. Except that Lazarus is requiring money for every interaction, and except that Lazarus is a monologue relationship as opposed to a dialogue. Lazarus has not once asked me what I want to talk about, but he said he's my friend. Now, there's a lot of shaky things that this whole thing can just blow up and say, fuck this, I'm not being blamed for this, you fuckers say it's my parents and I chose, Lazarus said I chose my parents prior to birth. It's like, not on your life, you fucking asshole. How, no. I'm not taking that on. I have no memory of that. How would you like it if I said you robbed a bank last night while you were sleeping and now we'd like to collect the money? It's like, I have no recollection of that. You have no recollection of robbing a bank. There's something fishy on here with this definition of you. If you can't tell the difference between the me that says I chose to move the finger and the me that you say chose these parents, that's a big gap. I had no recollection of choosing the parents, no idea why I would choose these parents, hate these parents. These parents are hurting me on a daily basis. They're hurting my siblings. They're hurting each other. No, I'm not taking that on. And so, but this was too dangerous at the time. Why? I had no social connection. I dropped out of school to do my own homeschooling, which was a great program, except it was completely isolated. I had no human beings that I could empathize with or relate to. Now, Lazarus, in my one reading with him at around age 21, maybe age 21, so I had one 30-minute reading, and in it, Lazarus said, among my life focuses, that I've come in this lifetime to deal with loneliness. That loneliness is a focus of mine for this lifetime. Well, what does that mean? Again, as a 21-year-old, should I be seeking out lonely places? Could it get any more lonely? Who is this me that's choosing these horrible focuses? I don't want to feel lonely. What's all this about? And so this is a tension that, again, felt too dangerous to deal with. Why? Because without Lazarus, there felt like an incredible vacuous void, like complete isolation. I didn't have any friends my own age. My parents were not trustworthy because they were not emotionally mature, because they dumped blame, shame, etc. right and left, because they wouldn't take responsibility for their own feelings. They were hypocrites. This wasn't trustworthy. And the question is, what to do? When I would turn to my siblings, they would protect my parents, because it was even less safe for them to acknowledge the dysfunctions of my parents. You have to have a certain level of self-confidence before you can afford to see, as a growing child, how dysfunctional your parents are. I mean, if you're completely dependent on them and have no idea how to cope with reality, and it dawns on you that your parents are morons, this is a disaster. How are you going to? It's like it's a traumatic crisis, and so this whole thing. Oh, they didn't mean it. Oh, poor parents. Of course, it's my father, not your husband that's the problem. Well, what should we do? And so this self-absorption of the child and adolescent is a real crisis. Now, later when I talked with therapists about this terrain, they expressed anger at Lazarus. That's an outrageous thing to tell a suicidal, traumatized teen. The last thing you need to hear is that you're responsible for your fucked up parents. This is outrageous, blah, 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 blah. But of course, those therapists weren't around then. Why? Because at 15 years old, I didn't have any money. And therapists are not dedicating themselves to children in need. They're dedicating themselves to clients who pay them $150 an hour, which is adults. And and they tend to validate the client more, because clients who are validated keep writing checks, and clients that are told that's a bunch of shit, I take the side of your parents, don't write checks. And so, there's all of that. I joined the Jack and Lazarus Forum, which was a step towards dialogue, meaning 99% of my relationship with Lazarus is a monologue. I pay money, I get a material, I listen to it, and the questions I have and what I have to say and stuff like that doesn't get integrated, and the next material comes regardless of whether I was confused about the last material or this, that, the other, and I'm told that I'm creating this. If I want to channel friend with a dialogue, then I have to change my beliefs or something like that. And so it's like, well, I'd like to say, what do I do here? Why didn't that meditation change my parents? What's this? And that's not there. And there's a great loss and a great loneliness and a great emptiness as an adolescent to just be left feeling that everyone wants to say it's my fault. No one wants to understand how I feel. No one wants to respond to those painful feelings. No one wants to lift the pain. And that is the travesty and the tragedy of so many adolescents in our culture, and the way that Lazarus contributed to that dynamic was this constant refrain. You create your own reality. Not your parents, they're illusions. You create your own reality with your beliefs and your payoffs and this and this. I cringe around asking a teenager to carry that. And yet, Lazarus was the most fun and intelligent person in my teenage life. Lazarus seemed more intelligent than my teachers, which is one reason I left school. Lazarus seemed more interesting and intelligent than the friends that just joked around and did kind of the crazy things people do in high school, which didn't seem really friendly or really intelligent. Lazarus seemed more honest than my parents. They would bring the New Age stuff in, but they wouldn't really do it. And in the worst case scenarios, I would watch my mother and my father use metaphysics to blame their child. Like if I expressed anger at my father for being a jerk, he would say, well, why don't you create me differently? You're working with Lazarus. Go create your reality. I'm not going to be a responsible parent. And my mother would say things like, she'd be in deep denial of her feelings or something. And she'd say, like, what's to forgive? It's all there for a reason. I don't have to forgive anything because it was there for a reason. It's part of my destiny. So there'll be this endless bullshit. And it's like, come on, Lazarus, have you got anything for this? And it's like, you created this. It's, oh my goodness, when does it end? When do I stop creating moronic parents? And so this is, but it's like, I'm afraid of being angry. I was afraid of the anger at God, all the bullying, being read the Old Testament at 5 years old and being scared of this horrible man who told parents to cut their children in half for sacrifices as a test of loyalty. Oh, you've proved your loyalty by being willing to murder your son by my word. You're the kind of gang member I want. And then we're on to Lazarus, talking about how I'm creating all this. And then as it came a little bit older, when the Jack and Lazarus Forum came on, there was one time I dared to express some anger towards Lazarus. And a woman named Helen Avalon didn't want to hear about it. Said, I don't want to hear about that. And it's like, oh, I've been doing it wrong again. And there's this constant message of negative ego, negative ego. It's like, is that me? Am I the negative ego? Is that why, all this stuff is going on? I'm a negative ego. It's like, okay, I've got to apologize for having anger. It's like, how does all that come out in a culture like this that is so insistent on suppressing intensity, and suppressing the shadow, on dumping shame on children, and on the bizarre hypocrisy and craziness that is so much of the irresponsible elements of New Age whatever. And there was never anyone to hold all of that. My parents were always afraid of intensity, emotions, although they lost it sometimes and expressed it. I became afraid of intensity for the loneliness of being in deep feelings with no one to validate, no one to mirror them, and instead a tormenting humiliation from my father for having deep feelings, a tremendous sadness and loneliness of having those deep feelings. And the Lazarus meditations did not touch that. I did the forgiveness meditations, I did this, I did that. I worked with shame, I worked with jealousy, envy, and rage. The meditations were graphic and beautiful, but I felt partitioned. I felt separated from the intensity of what I would now call a traumatic bubble. Partitioned trauma, dissociated from, to navigate through a life in a cultural terrain that doesn't and will not deal with that in a child. We don't teach our parents how to deal with their own trauma, let alone how to repair complex PTSD and trauma in their children. Lazarus was not teaching my parents how to do that. And in the back of my mind as an adolescent, there's also the sense this isn't fair. There's a sense like, well, fuck you, Lazarus. You created this. Why didn't you show up for my parents when they were children? Why didn't you have 10 channels? Why can't we talk? Why can't any of this happen? Why don't you, if you're so fucking big and da-da-da, why don't you take some responsibility for allowing this illusion, as you call it, to be so fucking painful? Why not take responsibility for allowing that? There's nothing stopping you, Lazarus, channeling through 100 people, and there's nothing stopping you doing this 200 years ago before all this pain and misery and before I was born. You're allowing this, and it's cowardly to dump that bullshit on a teenager rather than be an adult and own it yourself. If you're so much bigger than us, then do more than my fucking parents, not less, and stop charging me money just to have a monologue with you every fucking month. It's like, give us a break, you fucking coward. So this is the anger of the adolescent that has no space in adolescent because there's no one else to turn to. The child will run home to their abuser because there's nowhere else to go. So, this set in motion, quite a lot of grief. But because my father was humiliating any sign of emotion at the time, I was busy practicing not feeling so that he couldn't get it in and leverage that into full-on torment. And so that was my priority. I had to be able to be sociopathic stone-faced when I left my room, because his role was to try and pry out and hurt whatever emotion was there. And this is absolutely miserable. And so, what to do in that terrain? Now, of course, Lazarus talks endlessly about, you've got to heal the child and the adolescent and blah, and I was a child and I was an adolescent. And parts of me were not older than a child, when listening to the material, because when you have complex PTSD, you dissociate and freeze at 4, 5, and 6 years old. And you can't deal with the intensity of the trauma alone, and there are no adults that know how to deal with it. And the adolescent that's coming along learning he's creating his reality can't deal with it. And this is incredibly, incredibly painful. It's incredibly terrifying. Filled with paranoia. I'm going to get in trouble. I'm going to do it wrong. This, that, and the other. And that is incredibly lonely and incredibly painful. And I couldn't deal with the scale, basically. There's much too much to relate to happening much too fast. It's just very, very difficult. Now, all of my interest in metaphysics, etc., also separated me significantly, because all I was interested in is talking about Lazarus when I was 17, 18, 19, whatever. And most of the grown-ups around me thought that was weird and didn't want to talk about Lazarus. But that was the only thing I knew really how to talk about. And so there was a sense that if I talk about that, I will be rejected by everyone else. But I don't really want to talk about movies. I'm not watching movies. I'm scared of having a relationship because of all the pain and humiliation in my parents. I don't have much to do with your world, and nobody has anything to do with my world. And again, Lazarus is an isolating point at that point. My parents kind of make little jibes at me as, reminding me that I'm failing because they're not improving. And, my one grown-up friend, Kyle, at the time, in her 50s, I would say, had a kind of cautious relationship with Lazarus, like, she wasn't sure that he was safe and whatever, and she didn't like it when I was angry at my parents, and she was suspicious about Lazarus for encouraging healthy expressions of anger, and so this whole thing was just a nightmare in many levels. And it felt absolutely horrible to leave my siblings behind as I moved out at age 17. Because I knew what my parents were doing to them, and it was horrible. And there weren't any grown-ups sticking up for them. There weren't any grown-ups sticking up. Well, Kyle let me move into her house at age 17. But I didn't feel that I was welcome. The polite part of me was welcome. The obedient part of me was welcome, but my ideas and my feelings were not welcome. And so I felt like I don't have a home. I didn't feel like I had a home at home either, but I don't have a home anywhere. This culture doesn't welcome me. Peers don't welcome me. Grown-ups don't welcome me. I'm only welcome under kind of like there's this cautionary thing and Kyle's husband didn't like me at all. And why am I creating this? Why am I creating this? What are my techniques and all this? Now, there's one thing in this whole terrain of mix-up and real pain. I remember stopping meditating at times because the gap kept getting bigger and bigger between my dreams and reality. And it just felt like this is going to go on endlessly, and I'm going to lose track. I can't, at 14 years old, figure this all out and catch my reality up to my dreams. It's painful to dream. And that was horrible. There was one bright side in this whole terrain, and that was Lazarus has two yellow label tapes, one called Healing the Child Within, one called Healing the Adolescent Within. Now, these are month-long meditation processes, and I started doing them when around age 14. and I did them every day for a month, and then I did it every week for several years. And then I did every day for a month with the adolescent, and then once a week for years. So I did both series of tapes, and this was an opening. As I say, when I would do forgiveness meditation, I couldn't even feel my feelings at the time, let alone forgive the feelings I couldn't feel. And the fact that I had a very good memory and mental comprehension of the material meant that I could remember all the things that seemed to condemn me. You're a negative ego here, you didn't want it here, this wasn't. I could remember hundreds of hours of material and, this and that and the other, and it all seemed to be, a lot of weight that I couldn't change my life around. I just feel very, very sad for that young man. That very, very lonely, very isolated young man, sincerely in many ways doing the best and not having support. Now, doing those meditations did connect and did shift. Meaning, when I did the inner child and inner adolescent meditations, I felt a 30% shift that stayed for at least a decade. Meaning, for at least a decade after doing that work, I felt that my life was 30% brighter than it would have been without doing those meditations. And so this also, I start to see the friction and the dynamic with Lazarus. Now, I dated, my first girlfriend was a Lazarus girlfriend, meaning I met her in Orlando, Florida. She was twice my age. She was my first girlfriend. And I was 26 years old. And she was incredibly bossy. And there were all kinds of things that I started to notice that didn't seem healthy in the relationship. And she'd worked with Lazarus for 20 years. And, of course, this whole time, I left my one consultation with Lazarus feeling a bit numb, a bit confused, afraid of making mistakes, and not feeling in my body. And now I had new material to work with. One of your focuses is loneliness. Another focus is beauty. Another is this. And it's like, what am I to do with this? I'm afraid of being criticized in this situation. I'm afraid of this in this situation. What do I do with this? I don't know. And it felt scary to go into this terrain because I didn't know what to do with it. And there wasn't time to talk. It's like, any other questions? It's like, yes, this is, okay, our time's up. And does that make sense? Kind of. There's no more time to talk. I would like, 3 or 4 hours, to explore this and that and the other and to talk more and you to tune in and see that I'm dissociative, etc. It's like, now that I know what trauma is, I can see it in other people. Why can't you see it, Lazarus, in me? And so there's anger about this. There's question about this. There's pain around this. I don't want this presence that's been very valuable and where I have a lot of respect to be a source of pain and question and confusion. I don't want that. I want to be feeling like, yeah, this is healthy, this is fun, this is great. It's not feeling that way. And now my girlfriend is using Lazarus against me. You should do this, and you should. This doesn't feel good either. And why doesn't she know how to have a relationship if she's been working with you for 20 years? So you're not showing up, you're selling friendship, a lot of your techniques are not working and actually adding to pain. This is shitty. This is painful. Now, it got worse because at age 28, after discovering that when my partner was scared, she got angry and raged, but she wouldn't admit that she was scared, and I couldn't deal with the rage because of my own bottle-up regression, and none of that had worked with all of my work with Lazarus and all of her work with Lazarus. And I was being bullied, and I didn't want to fight, so I decided to leave the relationship and go take some relationship courses. Now, in those courses, in the first couple of weekends, I learned about permissions, boundaries, asking for your 100%, safe sex conversations, asking for what you want, negotiation, and I realized that this was what I needed to learn. And Lazarus had always said, our techniques work, we come from high levels, we see better than you because we're outside your set. And it's like, no, you don't, Lazarus. If you saw better than these guys, you would have taught my girlfriend how to ask requests and boundaries rather than have rages. You never said that in any of the tapes. You never said make requests, have boundaries. You never talked in common sense ways like this that work. What do you mean you're fun? What do you mean you're committed to success and work? This is bullshit. I've learned in 3 weekends. So there was, again, like, what do you do with this? How do you communicate that to a monologue? Who's your friend, not your teacher, but who only gives you tapes. For like, what is this? And so I stopped. I just said, I'm not going to deal with this. You don't want to talk. You don't want to show up in my mind. You don't want to have dialogues with enough time to actually learn. I don't want to wait another 2 years to talk to a friend. What kind of friend is that? And I don't want to be told this is me creating this, that somehow if I change my belief, you'd channel through my best friend or channel through me. Stop this bullshit. Cut it out. I'm not going to take on the full responsibility. And I also looked at concept synergy, from this kind of angle. Like, well, wait a minute. So they work with Lazarus all the time. Why do I hear rumors of this? Why do I hear that, Penny was a jerk to so-and-so in this location and Jack never returned? Why do I hear all this It's like, it's not just my girlfriend. It's not just me. These folks at Concept Synergy. What's going on there? It seems like they could have an excellent company. They could be committed to excellence, but they can't even come out with CDs when everyone else do. No. They've got to be years behind everyone. How is that excellent? They can't have a program as good as Audible. Lazarus talks about creating whole new sets of reality and talked about the information age and who controls the information will control the world and blah, blah, blah. All these mixed messages, like you're creating it all, but these things are the way they are. And we're outside your set, but you're creating. It's like, how's all this, where's this all fitting together? And in that whole expression of, I just said, enough. I'm going to learn what works. And, I'm not going to try and figure out how all this fits with Lazarus. Lazarus hasn't taught my girlfriend how to be a terrific girlfriend. He hasn't taught Concept Synergy how to run a great business. Lazarus hasn't taught Jack and Penny how to be, outstanding ethical people in terms of compared to other people that I know that I don't hear that from this person, but I hear it from here. It's like, my adolescent wants to say, show me someone who's doing it. Show me someone who's doing it perfectly, doing it right. That I can, because I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to do it right, but if someone knows how to do it right, then I can learn from them. But who are the people doing it right? You know, Lazarus has some of the most egocentric, obnoxious people I've ever met in the community. Did they become that way because of Lazarus? What? And none of these questions get asked or answered because that would be negative ego. It's like, oh gosh, I'm sick of this. I just want everyone to ask. Let's have free communication where everyone can ask whatever they want and develop as much candor as see what works with data. And so I started creating, much more successful conscious relationships, just figuring out what I wanted, asking for permission, making requests, stating boundaries, negotiating. It's like, this works. This works. I don't need to go into a room of belief. I'll just do this and this. And so this was the drift away. And I also felt hurt. It's not like Lazarus checked in with his friend and say, hey, you're drifting away. We care about you. No. The whole framework doesn't feel like the optimal framework I would design with a friend. Dialogues instead of monologues. I'm not going to charge you, Lazarus, to be your friend. Don't charge me to be your friend. Let's, if it's all about me and everyone else's illusion, how about having a topic that I'd actually like to talk about? How about this? Why don't you start channeling from my next door neighbor so that we can have a more intimate conversation? Or me. I'll volunteer. Stop pretending that there's this big me that I am, that I have no recollection of, and then you don't listen to this me, but you say it's me. Hello. And so, and this feels uncomfortable. This terrain feels uncomfortable because there's a part of me that feels the smallness of this. And then there's another part that says, yeah, and that's the part that needs help. That's not the part that needs to be blamed and told that they're creating everything. This isn't the part that's creating everything. It's difficult. It's difficult. Now, I just felt kind of in limbo with Lazarus for about a decade. Because by 28, when I realized that the workshops that I was doing were 5 times more fun and more effective at negotiating intimate relationships than anything I'd learned at Lazarus, it just seemed like Lazarus said you should focus on fun and success. I am, and that's taking me away from the Lazarus material. Go figure. Just too much to think about. Let's just get on with life. Now, that was very good in the growth period. Then I started to deal with loneliness in a variety of ways again in relationship, in a whole host of different layers. And the negotiating and the asking for 100%, I would keep upping my 100%, but people weren't upping their response to the 100%. So again, I found myself alone. I want to talk about these kinds of things. People don't want to think about them. I want to learn this. People are not interested in learning that. I want to spend 30 hours a week together. They want to spend 10 to 14 hours a week together. My goodness, it's just endless. I want people to reach out to me. They're not. I don't want people to reject me. They are, and so my expectations started growing and growing and growing. And people came up and kind of plateaued at a certain point. No matter how much I worked, it just then became unsustainable. So that was very painful and irritating. But there was no sense that going back to Lazarus would help any of that. It hadn't helped at all. I hadn't had a relationship, so that doesn't seem like it is. And concept synergy is a big part of this because in the 30 or so conversations I've had with, 12 to 20 Lazarus friends about odd things that concept synergy does or doesn't do relative to traditional business practices, They've come up wanting one, like, gee, Safeway doesn't treat me like that. Amazon doesn't treat me like that. This doesn't, something off, and then, Lazarus sold me a bunch of, or no, Concept Synergy sold me a bunch of crystals that turned out to be marked up 1,000%. So when I started buying crystals elsewhere, I realized they were 80% cheaper. It's like, how's that your friend? How's that spiritual friend to say, we're your friend, let's have a monopoly business and sell you things at 10 times more than many other people sell them? Yeah, that doesn't sound very friendly. And that didn't. So there's all these little things. And then it turned out Concept Synergy didn't like critical feedback and just ignored it or shunted it off on the customer because they're a monopoly. It's like, Lazarus, you gave them the monopoly. You chose to channel through one people even though you're a we. Why not channel through 5 people and fully express yourself? No. We're many beings, but we're only going to express ourselves as one. We're going to give them a monopoly. And we'll let them distribute all the material and manage everything, and that's it. Well, monopolies tend to correspond to poor service and slower service and all that. And it did. There would be these little pockets, and it's like, that doesn't feel excellent. That doesn't feel what I want. Other companies are treating me much better than Concept Synergy. That, again, is a grating thing because there's this kind of message from somewhere, I'm not quite sure where, but it's like because Jack would talk about this in the workshop. He would say, one person complained that now they have to fly here, and someone else just said they're grateful to exist or something like that. And so it's like, the person, you should be grateful. If you're a spiritual person, you should be grateful that I'm even making this available at all. You shouldn't, have anger and irritation and all this. And so there's these things like the good spiritual person doesn't complain. It's like, well, it would be easier not to complain if you weren't so shitty in some of these areas. These aren't excellent expressions. Don't you listen to the tapes? Is this it? I mean, if everyone listened to Lazarus, would they all run companies like this? The player is just, there's so much stuff around that. It took them 6 months to ship a $20,000 crystal because they were figuring packaging out for 6 months with full payment in advance. That was a crystal I saw later at a crystal shop for $2,000 that would have been there in 24 hours. And they charged me $600 with no logo. And so there's just, that's a crappy shipping, a crappy time, a crappy price. Nothing about it is excellent. So full price, slow shipping, expensive shipping, way over. This isn't excellent. And so how can I believe that I'll be excellent if I do all these techniques? If Jack and Concept Synergy are not excellent? It doesn't seem very believable. And I'm not getting stuck into this thing there again where it's all my fault. Like I'm doing all the exercises and this and that, and my parents are still shitty. I'm doing all this. It's like, no, I'm not getting caught off. And so I also studied a lot, about business and things like that and business excellence. And that works very well. And the return to Lazarus came when, out of fear and pain and a certain amount of desperation, I was sexually abused by a therapist that reactivated all the PTSD, etc., in childhood. That took therapists off the books in many ways because it was a therapist who did it and then other therapists covered it up. And it's like, I am not paying more therapists to fix up the abuse of other therapists and da-da-da. Then I discovered that I had PTSD and nobody had ever explained what PTSD was in $100,000 of therapy. It's like, that's fucked up. So again, so therapists are off. Everyone that I talk this way to, like I'm just talking to, doesn't respond with empathy, caring, and responsiveness. They just glaze over and avoid me because it's too much information in this culture. It's actually very grounded, useful information. If I had this information with you and your willingness to invest $10,000 and 30 hours a week, there's a very high odds that we could do something phenomenal with this. But people don't see the opportunity of transparency and quality time and willingness to prioritize. That's painful. That's lonely. I see the opportunity. Other people don't see the opportunity in me. That's painful. And it's not something that seems to respond to, 33-second techniques or something like that. And that's painful. Because then we get back to, no, Lazarus, your techniques don't work as well as this stuff over here. I wish we could talk about it. And I don't want to pay you to talk about it. It's like friends don't charge each other to be friends, in my book. And if it's my reality and blah, 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 how about listening to partly what I want? And so that's, there's a tension there and there's a pain there. However, when I got scared, when I got desperate, was when I broke my elbow. I'd never broken a bone before. And hang on a minute. So in that pain, physically, like 7, 8, 9, 10 pain, fear, 7, 8, 9, not sure that I could cope. It looked like one of the resources that could help was I listened to Ending the Pain, Ending Self-Punishment, Self-Forgiveness, the videos that I'd, the tape recording that I'd made when I was 14 years old, Self-Forgiveness, and those worked. And they worked more, meaning I felt things more than I did when I listened to those tapes in my teenagers multiple times, until I stopped listening to them, in part because I knew they weren't working. And it felt like I would be taking on shame to be saying that the reason they weren't working is because I didn't want them to. And it felt crazy making. Another, Lazarus talks about making things, things that are crazy making. It's fucking crazy making. To keep saying these work if you want them to, you desperately want to feel better, etc. You do them, no shift. And so, and my view all along is that to whatever extent Lazarus seeks to give and empower responsibility in his paradigms towards human beings, as someone who says they create a better and bigger reality, etc. Lazarus, in the framework of creating reality by causing or by allowing it, should be held to a standard higher than human beings, is what makes sense to me. If Lazarus says that whatever we create is what we really want, then if Lazarus is creating, miserable, failing students that he calls friends and then charges as students to talk with him, then you've got to hold Lazarus responsible for allowing his friends to be confused and blah, 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 as well. And what's his payoffs and stuff like that. And it just seems very squirrely, particularly in the context of watching my parents do the same thing endlessly, of holding their kids to a higher level of responsibility than they hold themselves. Why did, your mother did this, not my wife and all that. It just seems a little squirrely. So, having discovered that the techniques worked, and this is just a few months ago, meaning I felt so much relief and so much better after doing, multiple forgiveness meditations and stuff. And then relief that something was working to break the cycle. That also, is a tremendous relief, because one of the big problems because all of this growth took place, before the broken arm and the sexual abuse. And it's like all of this, the diet, the growing, the this and that, the other, all the efforts. It's like I know people who don't believe in creating their own reality, don't meditate, don't write a diary, don't have goals, don't do this, and they don't seem this miserable. They don't have hypocritical, blaming, shaming parents. It's like, why do all of this to have such a shittier emotional reality compared to this and the, something's painful about that. And the real pain is to think that there's something wrong with me, and that I'm wrestling with that, and they're not, because they're just not working with that set of beliefs. It's painful, and it gets very, very, very heavy and painful and depressive, and I don't want to see, I don't want to be aware, I just want to sleep. It's very, very painful. And so the forgiveness, the healing punishment, the ending the pain was helpful, and that's one of the things that I've noticed in growth in general, is that it depends on your start point. If you can imagine a stepping stone path where there's 10 steps, and here's your goal, and here's where you are, and there's 10 steps. Well, if you're on step 1, step 5, or any other step is a step forward towards your goal. But if you're at step 6, step 4 is a step backwards. What I suggest or mean with that is that if you are in extraordinary levels of pain, sometimes just about anything will help. But if you're feeling great, you have to find a pretty narrow band that will make you feel exceptional. And this is the stagnation trap of feeling pretty good. And it's a frustration. Stagnation is frustrating. But that's, and hedonic adaptation is frustrating. It's like when you're eating the best food and you're wearing the best clothes and you're in the great car and a great house and a great job. How does it get better from there when it all becomes familiar and old hat with hedonic adaptation? That's a real crisis. And that's frustrating. So in that sense, I wasn't sure that dealing with concept synergy and having the same wrestling things when I was feeling pretty good, was going to be a step forward. Just feels like, why do I have a friend who doesn't talk to me, that won't answer or listen? Why? I don't want to deal with that. Because I don't have to. I can just go have this other friend who answers questions, who has a dialogue, who respects, and doesn't say that I created my rotten parents and blah, blah, blah. And so let's just get that out of the way. Now, in place of incredible pain, fear, and shame, then opening up like anything, what's going to work? And then discovering Lazarus really works. Now, hedonic adaptation works with anything. Lazarus says it in a slightly different way, but so anyway, I rediscovered Lazarus through the tapes, and thank goodness they really helped. And then it's like, yes, there's a commerce of energy open that I've lost touch with, and Lazarus is the portal to that conduit of energy. Meaning it doesn't just come to me. It is nowhere to be found in the culture. But, a Lazarus meditation on fairy, for example. Oh my goodness, and so the pain is healed by a sense of beauty, a sense of goodness and truth. And there's so much liquidity and magnificence in there. And yet it's so easy for the pain to drown that out rapidly. And so I'm dealing again with hedonic adaptation, where after a 10-year break, Lazarus felt very fresh and very clear. Now, the din of anxiety and unanswered thoughts and stuff hum in the background and are slowly gaining amplitude. And so I have a sense of grief around already losing that sense of crystality, that clarity of, I can feel. It's like drinking water the first time in a desert. It's so alive. And then drinking water after 3 glasses of wine and a pudding and a chocolate cake and oh my goodness, it just feels nothing. It doesn't nourish me at a deep, deep hungry level. And the Lazarus healing meditations in that state of hunger, it's like that parched thirst, and then gradually being drowned out. It's like I want the clarity, and so I'm fiddling around with that right now. How to create the lucidity of a deep spiritual connection. And my adolescent is still not happy, with concept synergy. In this whole thing, it's like I noticed when I bought my first audio recording, it was the worst buying experience of any media product in my life. The password didn't work. They didn't reply to emails. They ignored suggestions. They couldn't open an MP3 file. They weren't interested in discussing ideas. They ignored feelings. So that's just for starters. Then when we download the product, it was 3 times bigger than any media product. I mean, this was like a gigabyte or something like that for an audio. This was an audio recording. And there was you couldn't set how much of how much of compression you wanted. Then there was no title on it. Then it had to be extracted out from Mac or a P. The whole thing was a joke. It had a long number rather than a tape title. Everything was worse about it than getting a cassette and putting it in. And this after they delayed years for CDs. Anyway, it was a complete joke, like the most unexcellent experience imaginable. And it's like the whole Lazarus thing would say, well, why are you creating this? What are your payoffs and all this? It's like, presumably I have the same payoffs in creating for Amazon, where I've bought $5,000 worth of books, 500 titles. They've all worked impeccably. They were all titled. They held your place. They opened on phones as well. They were easy. They synced with device. They did 100 times more excellent interface than a monopoly of the highest resonance to ever touch the planet. It's like, this is crazy. And of course, Concept Synergy does their normal thing. They have no interest in learning and growing around all of this. So it's like, oh, it's so disappointing. Another 10 years with Lazarus, they haven't learned anything about business excellence. Of course you can succeed in a monopoly business. That's incredibly easy. If you've got good material and you're the only distributor, people will put up with your crap. It boils down to that. And people do. So bravo. But is it excellent? And that's, so there's no redress with Concept Synergy. And I sent Jack a recording of some of my gripes, and he didn't even listen to it, saying he didn't want any intimate friends. I wasn't talking about intimate friends. I was talking about trying to deal with therapeutic abuse, and therapists talking about was this good for teenagers? Is that a great response to a company owner when you write to them as a company owner? They don't want any intimate friends, so they're not going to open your email. Just more, we don't want to hear you, we don't want to see you, we don't want to dialogue. Well, what else is new? Lazarus has been doing that for 40 years, monologue after monologue. So there's tons of adolescent gripes about this. And they're not going to go away anytime soon with Concept Synergy's attitude and that's just their sets of choices, and they're shitty choices as far as I can see. What to do with that? So, the thing that makes sense to me is that we do have a certain range of choices. When I was 15, I was deciding between killing myself, running away, or putting on Lazarus headphones and writing furiously poems filled with all my venting and stuff, and what books I read at the library. Now there's a wider set of choices, and again, similarly, like, can I find a life worth living? This and that and the other. Can I deal with Concept Synergy's bullshit? Yes. Can I find benefit in healing through the old tapes? Even easier than the new system. 40 years of research, we make it worse. Yes. Do I want to block out everything about Lazarus because I feel hurt and angry and confused about this, and this? Parts of me do. Parts of me don't. The younger part's afraid to, getting in trouble. The other parts want to. It's like, now we have our independence. We can give all this crap back to you. This isn't ours. We didn't decide to make a monopoly business. You did, Lazarus. You chose these folks. You set it all up this way. So I'll just buy 5,000 on Audible and do this when I have the patience to go through your rigmarole. And those are choices. They're not the best choices, but they're more empowered choices than when I was a teenager. And the pain, of course, is the juxtaposition of this kind of bullshitty aspect of the whole interaction and this phenomenal sense of a vortex of beauty that opens up around the material, that opens up around Lazarus's resonance, that opens up within me. Meaning there's an opening, a blossoming, a beauty, a wonder, a healing that opens in me in the context of that. And that's priceless. That's infinitely valuable. And, and I'm left with that gift of what is inside me that is not so much of this culture, but from some part of me beyond this culture that I love and value and see and cherish more than I value this culture and what this culture has trained me to be. This culture has trained me to be cynical. This culture has trained me to be analytical. This culture has violated. This culture has betrayed. This culture has done these things. And it's interesting because, this culture hasn't given me the eyes and the tool to deal with this. Part of what I was just seeing in terms of that crystal doorway of light disappeared as I started talking about this culture, which means I don't know how to honor the best parts, that at least the parts that I like the most in me. I don't know how to honor the parts that I like in me. I don't know how to deal with that. Which means that just being spontaneous, I dishonor them. And I lose them. And I don't know what was the, I don't know how I did that. And I don't know how to get them back. But I go into that probability field. I get into the round, so to speak, where that which I love the most in me, that which I feel touched with in me, that which is sacred within me, I get to meet it in the vortice of Lazarus's love, in the vortice of Lazarus's resonance. And that is priceless. And my adolescent doesn't like the rip-off of this and the biggest part of me says, we could deal with $200,000 of rip-offs and it would still be priceless to have some part of me that is beautiful, that's true, that's magnificent, emerge in the resonance in the container. That occurs in certain interactions with Lazarus. And is it painful that I can't fit it together with a sense of what feels right to me ethically and, optimal, and my sense of... No, that's very painful. There's a gap between my definition of friendship and ethics and loving and healthy and spiritual and what I experience in the full range with concept synergy and Lazarus. There's a gap, and that gap is very painful. And it's painful that when I try and resolve the gap, it gets bigger. It doesn't get worse because concept synergy ignores it. And that itself is a violation. It's like, that's not loving, that's not empathic, that's not the... it gets worse trying to say, hey, why is this going on? I don't like this. This feels shitty. What's going on? Why aren't I why am I getting better service at Safeway? Why? What's going on? It's painful that can't, the answer obviously, well, you're an illusion, we don't care as much about you as, and we don't have to, we're a monopoly, is kind of what it boils down to. The message is you don't matter. It's a very painful message to get juxtaposed with this really profound sense of mattering. Because the part of me that opens up is the part that feels incredibly mattering. And then it's sliced next to an experience that says you don't matter. It's like, so painful. It's very, very painful. And so, of course, the staff of Concept Synergy, like everyone else, will deal with, their impact and stuff, either in this lifetime or next, as we all will. Lazarus will deal with whatever impact of his choices of choosing this and monopoly and whatever, and already is, because there's apparently no time in his reality. And I will face the pain of these unresolved things in order to open up to this sense of eternal beauty that is just, it's too beautiful to turn away from just because everything doesn't line up in the way that it seems it ought to. And as I do trauma work, my expectation is that more of me will be released from the primary identity of the child and adolescent as I am able to face the griefs, the traumas, the hurts, the pain that were just too much for them, but that led to this incredible tonnage being pressed down on my being and freezing these ages at a level that is almost impossible to feel. It's just so very heavy. And so the adult part of me is able to be much more playful and magical. I'm just brought back into these icy bubbles of pain and shame in childhood, where the grief of that just overwhelms me rather than being able to bring the warmth. I get sucked into those young ages as I connect with the feelings that are so overwhelming, rather than lifting out and becoming the adult. And so I'm either dissociated from the child and adolescent and thus more controlled by them, or I become them and thus express them, or I'm dissociative and depressed. How to bring all those together is the challenge, of my daily life, at this time.